Hey, welcome to the TeacherGoals podcast. This is your host, Erica Terry from Healthy Wealthy Educators. So excited tonight because we have our founder. I joke all the time and call him the man behind the memes. But we have our founder, Brad Weinstein, with us tonight, and he is going to be giving us so many tips and strategies about how to implement a restorative and social emotional approach to school discipline. And you know me well enough by now to know that I'm just going to toss in a few extra questions at him about the Teacher Goals community and a little secret just in case you didn't know. He just turned 40 this week. So we're going to celebrate his birthday as well. All of that is going down tonight. But before we do that, I want to know who we have with us tonight. Where are you from? Your role in education. And tonight I put your favorite tech tool because I've seen a lot of people attended ISTE this week. And so it had me thinking about tech. What are you using in your classroom? What are you using in your personal life? We want to know, what is your favorite tech tool? Where are you from? And what is your role in education? Now, if this is your first time here with us for the Teacher Goals podcast, I'm going to share with you how we get down. We are here every week, and I get to interview some wonderful guests. During the interview, feel free to add to the comments any question that you have, because at the very end of the interview, we answer your questions. I ask your specific questions to our guests and they answer them. So as you are listening in, go ahead and put your questions in the chat, or you can hold on to them to the very end and I will pull them up at that time. And so we have people putting in the chat their favorite tech tools, where they're from. And this is a good opportunity for you to engage with other people in our community and to find out what they're using in their classroom so you can use them as well. Because we have so much to do tonight. I told you guys, we got a birthday celebration, and we have some questions. And so we are going to go ahead and jump right into our interview tonight. And then at the very end, like I said, we'll be answering questions and I will be pulling up some of the tech tools that you share. So make sure you get those in. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring up our guest, Brad. Hey, Brad.
Hey, Erica, how's it going?
It is great. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. It's 90-something degrees out here in Indiana. I'm sure it's even worse in some of the listener spaces, but it's hot, so I've been inside quite a lot.
Yes, it is definitely hot down here in the South, but we've been getting some rain this week, so it's cooled it down a little bit for us. I know I'm not complaining. But yes, we have so much to talk about tonight. But before we get to talking, I just have to say happy birthday. Welcome to the 40 Club.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's one of those things where you have to remember how old you are all the time. I don't remember if I was 37 or 39 half the time, but now when you're 40, you're not going to forget how old you are. So, yeah, thanks for everyone saying happy birthday. It's one of those things where, man, it goes fast, so you better enjoy it.
Yes, and one day you'll be like me where you're well into your 40s, but my daughter thinks I'm 37, so I just go with that, like, oh yeah, if that's what you think, that's how old I am. And so we stick with that.
Nice.
And so happy birthday. But we're gonna go ahead and just jump right into it tonight, just in case you're on here and you don't know. This is the actual founder of TeacherGoals. So all of those memes that make you laugh, keep you inspired, keep you motivated. This is the man right here that is behind all of the greatness that comes from the TeacherGoals community. And so with that being said, kind of start us off by telling us about who you are, what you do, and just give us a little insight on what made you start TeacherGoals.
Sure. I have, I started off my education career at the elementary level, and I taught middle school for about a decade or so. I was a principal. I was a director of curriculum. I wrote the book Hacking School Discipline, which we'll talk about in a little while. I wasn't expecting it to do what it did. I was expecting to remain an educator for the foreseeable future. And now what I do is I go around and I help schools implement the restorative practices that we talk about in the book. I continue to work with TeacherGoals and to make sure that the teachers feel seen, heard, valued, have a voice. So I continually work with teachers as well. Like discipline is something that I do as a job and something I do and I help schools with. But it's also, you got to laugh instead of cry sometimes. So I've never lost my sense of humor, even though I became an author and wrote a book about discipline. You still have to have a sense of humor. You have to have some moments where, something you just got to laugh about, because if not, the job will beat you down. And sometimes, you just got to laugh because you would not know or believe, unless you were an educator sometimes, what the job was actually like and what you go through.
That is so true. And when you talk about laugh instead of crying, that's definitely what your memes do for me. But you know by now that I'm always in people's business. So tell us, what happened in that middle school that made you, where you recognize, like, okay, I'm not going to cry, I got to laugh, and I'm going to write a book that's going to help other people implement restorative and social emotional strategies for school discipline? Like, what was going on?
Sure. So when I moved from elementary, elementary social emotional learning is more prevalent. There's a lot of curriculums of social emotional learning. There's more of an emphasis in the schooling. When you're an elementary teacher, there's a lot more emphasis on social emotional learning. But when you go into the secondary world, what I noticed was that there was a lot less emphasis on the social emotional component of teaching. And what I also noticed was there was a disconnect, because these kids, when they get to become teenagers, they have just as many social emotional needs, if not more, than they did when they were younger. So I noticed there was a lot of conflict, a lot of cliques, a lot of, people not getting along, a lot of talking when I was teaching, a lot of fights, and all kinds of things. So when you think about the middle school level, I realized that there wasn't really something out there that existed when it came to classroom management. And, there's a lot of stuff you read about elementary in that subject and in that realm, but there's nothing that really hits on what to do with kids once they become a little bit older. And in my work, I've realized that, the restorative practices that we do, the social emotion that we do, the trauma-informed learning practices that we work with schools to develop and implement, that's for everyone. I don't care if you're 0 years old. I don't care if you're 99 years old. You have to be able to be a collaborator. You have to be able to be a good teammate. You have to be able to know how to accept rejection. You have to know how to resolve conflict. You have to know how to work with people that are different than you, look different than you, have different beliefs than you. And what I noticed again was at the middle school level, we did a great job of teaching and had great content and great curriculum maps, but we didn't always have a way to build those relationships and those connections with the kids. And what I noticed is that when restorative practices have been around for a long time, but it's not really written for a classroom setting. It's more of a bigger conflict. Like there's been a fight, there's been, some sort of outside of school altercation or argument. There's harm that's been caused. It's not something that is typically done, for situations that are smaller, situations that don't rise to the level of the office. So it wasn't really something that was accessible, I guess you could say, at the classroom level. So the reason why our book did so well, in my opinion, is because we actually wrote it in layman's terms. This is how you can use it with real kids in a real classroom at all levels, not just at the elementary level.
Love it. And so Hacking School Discipline definitely did well. And in it, you share specifically, like, you're talking about this restorative and social emotional approach to school discipline. But for someone who may not have read the book yet, or this may be their first time kind of hearing these terms, can you kind of break it down for us? When we talk about using a restorative and social emotional approach to school discipline, like, what does that really mean?
Yeah, there's a lot of surface level restorative practices out there. It's we don't suspend kids, and instead we do this, right? So a lot of schools are moving towards and moving away from suspensions and expulsions, and moving away from a lot of the punitive measures that we have going on in schools. But the problem is that even if we have better discipline policies and we have more restorative policies, we're not changing the quantity of kids that are getting sent down to the office in the first place. So when we have the same number of kids going down, you need to realize that it's a tier 1 thing that we're working on here. It is at the classroom level with kids, before they get to that point where they get in trouble and they get to that point where they get sent down to the office. What are all the proactive things we can do? What are the restorative components we can do to build community and belonging in the classroom while we have them in there? And how do we get it to where kids don't want to act out as much because they're a part of the environment that they're in? They're not actually, when you feel ostracized, when you feel like no one really cares about you, when you don't feel connected, not just to the teacher, but to the kids in the classroom, you have a lot less to lose, less skin in the game. When you feel connected and you belong and you matter, you're gonna not want other people to mess up the learning environment or mess up the community that you're in, right? And another thing is that even when you have them wanting to do the right thing and wanting to be part of that community, we have to also not lose ourselves in who we are. So it's not about making conformists. It's not about, this is the exact way you need to do this, and this is the exact words you need to say. We need to let kids be who they are. And through doing restorative things like circles, through doing a lot of collaborative work, through all of those things, we need to have it so that the kids, again, they don't lose their identity and they don't lose who they are. But we work on how to better say that thing that you said and tell the girl not to shut up when she's talking to you, when you don't want her to talk to you. We need to work on all those approaches. But the other thing we don't realize and we don't always implement in schools is that if we tell a kid to not do something, we don't always give them the replacement opportunities. We don't have that talk. We don't let them problem solve themselves. We just say, stop talking. Don't do that. Get off your phone. We don't really problem solve. A lot of the time, because we have 25 kids in the room, we're quick to call out behaviors, but we're not very quick to actually develop afterwards. Hey, I know we had to move you during class today. Let's talk through what happened and let's come up with some alternatives, because you might find out that one kid was talking to another kid and the other kid did not know what to do in that situation. And I talk to adults and I'll say, Erica, if you were at a staff meeting and another staff member kept on talking to you, and then after the staff meeting, the principal came up to you, Erica, and talked to you about, not paying attention during the staff meeting, I said, Erica, would you actually know what to do and what to say to that other staff member that kept on talking to you? And I say this to adults all the time. Most of them are like, they give me these blank looks. Like, I actually don't know what to do if somebody was to do that to me. Right. So what we do is we don't really work on those skills. We just want kids to behave in a certain way or do a certain thing, but we don't give them the solutions. And when we're thinking about those solutions, not only what should you do when another girl's talking to you, they might come up with a solution that's not that great, like tell her to shut up, and things like that. Well, I don't think that would probably get you the result that you want. Let's think of another way. And in some cases, I might need to give them some ideas. And I always not only give them one idea or have them develop their own idea, is I always go one deeper, because when we don't actually do a strategy that works the first time, we're quick to revert back to telling the other girl to shut up or whatever it is we're trying to do, right? Mm-hmm. So I go, well, I could ask her to stop talking to me. Okay, that's great. How should you say it in a way that's not going to make her offended? And then we practice that. And then I go, okay, but if you do ask her to stop talking to you and she doesn't, what do you do next? So I always go at least one deep, because even if we give consequences, and I hate to say it, but we need consequences for actions. Those aren't punitive. Those aren't suspensions. Those aren't expulsions, unless it's a safety issue, of course. But we need consequences. If we're not doing what we need to do, there's positive consequences for doing the right thing, and there's positive consequences for doing what you need to do, but there's also negative consequences sometimes to your behaviors. Like if you cause harm, you need to fix that harm. And what I notice is that we don't always hold kids accountable for their actions. Like we say, stop talking 97 times until we're blue in the face, without actually addressing that and the root cause. So when I'm looking at that and I'm looking at all these things, okay, and I noticed that somebody had asked, advice to support members. These relationships have to be deep, authentic, and worked on every single day. It's not something where we can just build a relationship with a kid in the first day of school or the third day of school or the seventh day of school, and then we move on to teaching math for the rest of the year. Like, this has to be something that we commit to every day and something we need to work on every single day. And the other thing when it comes to the social emotional learning component is that we have a lot of kids that come to us from all kinds of different experiences, and we need to be careful about what culture we are saying we want you to be like, right? And what certain way you want to say things. And we need to also learn as educators that in certain cultures, different things mean different things to different people as far as what you say, whether or not you make eye contact, language, all those kinds of things.
Yes. I mean, you hit on so many points. And so we're going to just dive deeper. I was trying to capture some of the things that you said while you were talking. And so let's kind of dive deeper in a few things. So, first of all, what I picked up on is that you talked about how we need to ensure that our students don't lose their identity. And so, how can we as educators, especially in the classroom, make sure that we're not doing cookie cutter methods and allowing and helping our students to truly be themselves while also holding them accountable?
Absolutely. And there's, I know a lot about those kind of practices and culturally responsive teaching, but I'm not going to claim to be the absolute expert and authority. There's other people that have written on that. Zaretta Hammond has written on that. Culturally responsive teaching in the brain. And there's other great books about this to get real deep with that. But you need to realize who you are. Like, you need to realize, like, for me, I'm a white male educator. That's who I am. And I need to acknowledge that and know that I have a certain worldview, a certain perspective. I was raised in a certain way. And I need to realize that students that look different than me, students have a different gender than I am, and even students that do look like me have all had different experiences, different backgrounds, different upbringings. So we need to make sure that our viewpoint and our way is not the only way. We also need to have it so that we're not correcting the way the kid said this or correcting the way the kid said that. We also need to have a classroom that everyone is seen, represented. I look in the walls when I walk into a room, and I'm seeing who's on the walls. And I'm seeing what's on the bookshelves. I'm looking at that and be like, are the students in your classroom seen in your curriculum, on your walls, in your textbooks, in your reading materials, and all those other kinds of things? We also have to realize is that when we're working with students and we're looking at being culturally responsive, the students need more time to connect with each other. They need to hear each other's voices. We need to do circle work. We need to have, community circles where we're talking about something sometimes serious, like, talk about something that makes you angry. They might not realize that the kids, some of the kids in their circle have had run-ins with the police that were, injustices, and they've been followed around Walmart, and they need to hear these things from each other. They also need to hear a perspective, because someone might be a female and they might have had a certain thing that makes them angry that a male might not have to deal with. And it's something that's very empowering when you have a bunch of different cultures and different backgrounds in that community circle in a safe space, getting to hear each other, learn from each other, and even advocate for each other when things go wrong and injustices are seen. We also need to make sure, when we're working with all kinds of kids, is that we do collaborative work a lot. Like, our kids are working constantly with each other. We're communicating with each other. We don't let them always pick their groups. We purposefully make groups and groupings of students that aren't, who they would typically work with in class. We just need a whole lot of opportunities for kids to hear other kids that don't have their exact same identities, exact same culture, all those other kinds of things. And again, a community circle is one of those starting points for that. But it goes a lot deeper than that. And again, I'm not going to claim to be the expert in culturally responsive teaching. I know enough to be dangerous, but I want to give homage to the people. I incorporate a lot of that into what I do, but it's not something that I could ever write a solo book about. But it's something that the restorative practices amplify, and something that our book amplifies is the ability to do those.
Yes. And so the book, Hacking School Discipline, someone asked, what's the title? Hacking School Discipline is the book that we're talking about tonight. And one thing that you talked about is that we need to give students consequences for their actions, but do it in a way, that holds true to these principles. So kind of go a little further with that. Like, what are some specific examples of how we can hold our kids accountable?
Absolutely. Something I want to point out, though, before we even get into that, is that if we don't have the proactiveness built in, if we don't have the relationships built in, if we don't give the kids a voice and a choice, if the kids don't feel like they matter in our class, none of what I tell you on how to do discipline or how to do consequence is going to matter that much, right? Even a consequence given to you by if somebody who you don't like, or you don't feel like they like you, or there's not a relationship there, gives you a consequence, even if you deserve it, you're not going to feel good about it, right? And if you think about that as an adult, even, right? We've all worked with administrators that we've loved. We worked with administrators we didn't love, right? And if an administrator I love would give me some constructive feedback, you know, I would be able to take it and I'd be able to grow from it. But if somebody I didn't respect and somebody that, you know, didn't really pay attention to me and I didn't have a connection with, if they told me something, I'd be like, what do they know? They haven't taught in 19 years and blah, 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 right? And that's how the kids feel about us. And when we're giving them consequences. So I want to say, is the classroom environment proactive? Are the actual expectations fair and clear and consistent? Only then, you know, can we think about fair consequences and consequences for actions. So here's an example of a consequence for your action. Okay, that's restorative, logical. So two students are talking to each other, right? And they won't stop talking to each other. And they won't stop talking to each other. And I've used my proximity. I have, you know, gave them the teacher eye. I have done all those things. But before that, I have to think about this. Have I given the kids a break? Have I done it? You know, have I talked for too long in a row? Are most of my students confused right now? I have to also be very reflective of the room in general, you know, because sometimes I had them sit for 19 minutes in a row and listen to me. So they're going to be a little bit squirrely. So again, you have to be very reflective. You have to do your due diligence. Only when you've done, you know, what you needed to do and they're still talking, that's when I get into that, you know, consequence part. So, and again, these consequences are never public. They're always one-on-one when possible. Unless the kid's, you know, running with scissors in the room, then you can't, you know, have a one-on-one conversation later because it's a dangerous situation, right? Or a kid's actively flopping on the floor and screaming, you know, that's something that you might have to address pretty quickly. But if a kid's on their computer, if they're on Minecraft, if they're on their phone, and it's not impacting the whole rest of the class, you have to decide, when am I going to intervene, if any? You don't have to call out a kid on their phone in front of their 25 peers. I'm going to tell you that. That's not going to go very, very well. It's always going to be a power struggle. It's going to be embarrassing for them, and they're not going to be embarrassed by you in front of their peers, and it's going to cause conflict, right? So you have to also worry about when you're doing this. So if kids were talking during class and it wasn't causing the whole rest of the class to get off task, I would find a good time when I had a break. I would do a turn and talk. I would do some sort of group activity. They go back to their stations to do an activity. It's now time to read or to do our math problems. You know, I find a good time. I walk up to the girl or the boy or however they identify, and I walk up to them and I would say, hey, you know, I noticed that you were talking when I was teaching and it makes me feel a little bit sad. Or, you know, I tell them how it made me feel. Can you tell me more about that? So I actually will ask them, can you tell me more about that? Here's what I noticed. Here's how it made me feel. Can you tell me more about that? Because we have to give them a voice. We have to actually let them speak, because what if they weren't talking? What if they actually were one of 17 kids on their cell phone at that time? You know, what if I didn't actually see what I thought I saw? And in some cases, the kid was on their cell phone because their mom's in the hospital. And that's something I have to help them problem solve, how we can communicate with the hospital or your mom, you know, in a more productive way, right? So I always ask, can you tell me more about that? After I hear them, I always validate it and I say, you know, thank you so much for sharing that. What I heard was, and I always use that reflective listening, right, to make sure they're heard. I restate what they had said. I thank them. They could tell me that my class is horrible and I hate you. And science sucks. And I would say, thank you so much for telling me that. What I heard was science is a little bit, not your favorite subject right now. So you might want to reframe it a little bit, right?
Right.
But then I tell them, hey, but if I do see you talking to Susie, or I do see you talking to Bethany, or I do see you talking to whoever you're talking to again, I'm going to have to move your seats next. I'm going to move their seat, because if two people are talking to each other, what's logical is to remove the distraction from each other. And I'm not doing this in front of their whole class. I'm not saying, hey, if anyone else talks, I'm going to move you too. Very quietly, hey, I'm going to have you move over here for the rest of the class period. And then you have to actually, if they do it again, have to actually do it.
Right.
Because if you don't do it, oh, give me another chance. Or, well, I really would do it next time. You know, if you don't do it and you give them 19 more warnings, then what they're going to learn is that you don't actually say what you mean, and you don't mean what you say. You don't mean business, right?
Right.
But it doesn't end there, right? After I do have to move them, and again, I'm working on a logical progression of things we might try, and that's part of what I'm working on in my PD is, what do I try first for a certain behavior? What do I try second? And how many times do I try this? So when I move them seats, I go up to her a little bit later, or him, or whoever, I go up to them a little bit later after the fact. I'm not going to have a big long discussion because in a classroom you got 30 kids, right? You don't have time to have a 5-minute conversation right then and there when you're trying to get back to the class and get back to the lesson. I touch base later and I'll talk to her and I'll say, hey, I had to move you when I had asked you to do this. You had mentioned that you were talking to her because she wouldn't stop talking to you or whatever, right? All right, then we get into that, what I talked about before. What could you do instead of that next time? And they might go with, well, I don't know what I would do. They might go with, well, tell her to shut up. They might give you some things that are not the most productive or whatever. Right. But once you have that plan that you come up with together, the next time you have the girls that are talking to each other or the boys that are talking to each other, you revert back to that plan you came up with. Hey, remember the last time we talked about this? You said you'd ask her to stop. Did you do that? Mm-hmm. Then it's their plan. It's a lot more powerful, right? And I hold them to that. Mm-hmm. And if they won't stop talking, I try that again. I move their seats again. Then I move their seats again. After I've tried it 3 to 5 times, then I might move their seat for longer next time. And, same thing with technology. If you're misusing your computer, I'm going to give you every opportunity to put it away or get off of Minecraft. But if you won't get off of Minecraft, you're going to have to lose your device for the rest of that class period. And that's logical. If the distraction is the computer, the consequence should involve the computer. If the distraction is the phone, the consequence should involve the phone. If they're talking to each other, it should involve the people that are talking to each other, right? So it needs to be logical. And when you think about the restorative component, the reason why I love restorative practices, but I'm also working on, beyond that, is because harm is not always really caused in every situation.
Right.
So, if a student is by herself on Minecraft or a student is by himself on his phone, is harm really being caused to anyone but the kid themselves? So you can't have the big restorative conversation for somebody that's not really causing a huge amount of harm to somebody else. And we're going to go through the whole process, right? So that's why I like that approach where we do some of the restorative, we do give them a voice, but we don't go through the big, long process in the classroom because we don't have time.
Right.
To do the big, long process. And we also have to think about the natural consequences because sometimes the kids don't have empathy for each other. I don't know if you noticed that, Erica, but empathy is on the decline everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
Facebook thread, you're going to see empathy is on the decline in a lot of places, right? Even as adults, we don't have empathy for each other. We just, we talk the talk, we don't listen. So we might get into that empathy thing, but we also don't really get into the natural consequence and actually ask them, hey, how is being on Minecraft during class impacting you? We ask a lot about how it was impacting others and how to fix it for restorative practices. But the natural consequences are the things that I don't have to do as an educator to them. It's something that happens naturally. You run down the hallway when you shouldn't, you fall and you trip. That's a natural consequence of running down the hallway. You fell and you tripped, right? But we don't really talk about that. We talk a lot about who did you impact? How can you make it right with them? But we don't really put it back on them and have them think, how is it impacting you, right? And I saw somebody in the comment, Jennifer mentioned that adults need to work on empathy as well. So when I think about restorative practices, and again, I do restorative practices, but I also combine it with social emotional learning, applied neuroscience, trauma-informed practices, equitable practices, because no one has all the answers. Not one system, not PBIS, not MTSS, not one of them has every situation for every kid. So when we look at that, about that, on empathy, are we in the staff lounge talking about each other? Are we actually resolving conflict as adults? Is the principal having a restorative conversation between 2 adults in the building? Is an adult able to resolve their own conflict with another adult instead of talking about them when they didn't fix the copier when they jammed it, right? Do they know how to actually approach that? So I would say that the leadership in a school needs to work with their educators, just like we expect the students to be getting restorative practices too, because we have empathy a lot for the kids as educators, but we don't really have empathy with each other all the time as well.
Yes, there are so many great tips and strategies that you have shared with us tonight. But with all good things, there are challenges. And so when people are trying to implement this approach to school discipline, what are some of the challenges that teachers face and what can they do to overcome it?
Absolutely. So a challenge with this is the surface level restorative practices, where we say we're restorative. It's on our website. It's in our policy. It's somewhere else, right? But the reality is it doesn't go very deep. So we can have restorative policies in the office, but if the teachers aren't restorative in how they interact with the kids, how they build relationships, you're going to have the same quantity of issues, except for you're going to handle the negative component just as well. So I would say we do a spray and pray kind of method in a lot of places where we send somebody to a training and then we expect them to come back and get that buy-in from the rest of the staff, and no one else was at the training. And I compare that to, okay, that'd be like one person going and seeing the newest Avenger movie and then going back and telling everyone how awesome it was and we should do what the Avengers did, and no one else saw it, right? So basically we're getting secondhand excitement from a couple of staff members. So the staff buy-in is gigantic. It's huge. It's something that they have to be part of the journey, not just it's a bunch of administrative work in the summer and then we lay out our policies for the staff to follow. You have to be a believer in the work. And when you realize that negative and the punitive is quick and it's easy, but it never actually changes behavior, or at least very rarely ever changes the behavior. So it's one of those things where you have to run maybe 15 circles before you get it to go well. You can't just give up. Oh, I tried that one circle my crazy principal talked about, so I'm not going to try it again, right? Or I tried having a restorative conversation with the kid, and they told me to go screw myself. And I'll say, well, restorative practices is not the silver bullet. Sometimes it goes wrong. It's the go-to method. It's where we always start, and it might take 97 restorative conversations before a kid actually gets it. It might take 97. We have kids that are high school seniors that still have problems with their emotions and have problems on how they talk to people, right? So if you're a third grade teacher, don't get discouraged because you had a few conversations with a kid that didn't go your way, and you didn't get them to quite see it yet. So it's about the long term. It's not about that one immediate situation that you had with a kid. So I just want to throw it out there that it is something that will take you a while to get really good at. Just like I did project-based learning, I did Genius Hour. I let the kids choose their own projects when I was a teacher, and it was a disaster the first couple of times, absolute disaster, and I almost gave up on it. And over time, I kept with it, and by the end of the year, I had kids doing projects that had never did a single worksheet in the entire year, creating these masterpieces for projects, right?
Right.
But I ask people, what's the alternative? The alternative is we're going to get what we always get, which is our students of color getting suspended at a 2 to 3 time higher rate than their Caucasian peers. We're going to get students with IEPs getting suspended at least double as often as their non-IEP peers. We're going to have continue to see the scores that we're seeing. So I look at it this way: if we're going to continue to do our punitive practices and we're not going to change as the adults, we're going to get what we've always gotten. So when people ask me, well, prove that restorative practices works, I'm like, prove what you're doing works. It's you know what I mean? Like it's not working. That's why I'm here. So again, you're going to have kids who are coming and they're not going to get it that year. But I will say it's still the go-to method. You might have to occasionally suspend a kid that did something big, but you don't have to suspend them for 5 days. If they got in a fight, maybe we can do 2 or 3 days with a restorative justice conference and reintegration conference and actual discussion with the other kid and figure out and get down to the root of the issue. We don't have to put them in ISS where they just sit in a room all day. Let's put them in a room with an adult where we actually have teaching and conflict resolution and give them skills and components and all those other kind of things. So I would say when we're thinking about this and we're thinking about, the restorative practices and we're thinking about the social emotional component of this, it's not a silver bullet. It's not a quick fix. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. And it's not, a get rich quick scheme, kind of thing like that.
Right.
It's going to take you a long time to get going. But once you have it going, it's going to stick because it's going to be embedded in everything that you do.
Awesome. And so for someone that is inspired tonight and they're like, I am ready to start, what is one action that they can implement tomorrow? Or if they're on summer break and they're like, I'm going to start the school year off strong, what's that one action that they can start?
So one action you can start, I always tell people to start small. You can't go, like I've been to when I do trainings with schools everywhere, I give them like the broadness of it. I give them a lot of different strategies. I show them the big picture. I show them, what's behind the curtain. because we have to give teachers and administrators, here's the big overall picture, right? I have to show them the whole thing, but I say, we need to start small, because if you try to do all of it, you're going to do none of it, because you're going to be overwhelmed and you can't be good at everything all at once. So I say you have to actually go very slow. I would just do as much reading as you can at first before you actually try anything. I would go and observe another teacher who's doing these things in action and see how they do it. Because one of the big things I do when I visit schools is I'll model a circle, and I'll show them that, yeah, I'm from Indiana, but I can go into, Nevada, I can go into California, I can go into Detroit, I can go wherever, and I can do a classroom circle with your kids. Sometimes they have to see it in order to believe it, right?
Right.
So I would say, if you're going to do anything, it would be starting small with proactive practices. Try to build that learning environment to the best you can get it, so there's less discipline issues in the first place. Try to look at what you're doing. Try to do circles. Try to get to know your kids. Try to build it continuously. So when I think about this and what you can actually do, it's really helpful to actually get formally trained, so that you have something to work. You might make it your own a little bit, but if you have one person that went to a conference coming back and showing you what you should do versus you experiencing it yourself. So I would recommend getting training. I would recommend reading books, and you can read my book. You can read other people's books. You can read whatever you want to do. And I would pinpoint, think about a plan. In year one, my goal is to implement one or two things and get really good at doing those one or two things. Because guess what, Erica? I work with schools who also have curriculum, who also have other things they're implementing at the same time, who are also 4 years deep into something else, right?
Right.
If you try to add what I'm talking about to everything else you're already doing and do all of it at once, it's not going to work. But what I will say is that it's a time thing, but we spend a lot of our time redirecting students. We spend a lot of our time in conflict. We spend a lot of our time dealing with unmet needs and behaviors. So I would say that the things that we talk about are actually going to buy you back classroom time, because we're going to have less conflict. We're going to have less kids acting out. We're going to have less kids that are going at each other or screaming at you across the room, because we are proactive in the first couple months of school, so that you can actually, in my opinion, teach as much, if not more, eventually. But it's about that time commitment towards the beginning.
Awesome. And so for people that want to learn more about you, we know that, we can find you at TeacherGoals, but where else can they find you?
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter. My handle is Weinstein, EDU, WEINSTEIN, EDU. I do some trainings. So if you go to teachergoals.com/PD, you can find me and contact me there. But I'm always online. I'm always in social media, and I love working with schools.
Awesome. Well, we have learned so much tonight. So many tips, tools, and strategies. And the comments are burning up. And so I just want to say thank you so much for joining me tonight. Thank you so much for blessing us with all of these tips and inspiration.
Absolutely. And thanks for having me, Erica. It's really great to actually be on the show that is on the TeacherGoals pages. So thanks for having me tonight.
Yes, I'm so glad that you could join us. And so we're going to dive right into the Q&A. For those of you that may have been holding on to your questions, now is the time. So go ahead and put them in the chat. And so I'm going to just start off we have Makia, who says, what advice do you have to support staff members who feel like building relationships with children are strictly transactional?
Absolutely. And this is hard, because this is a mindset. It's not just, I can do circles poorly. Like, I can go through the motions of doing circles. I can go through the motions of welcoming students to the door, right? I can go through the motions of asking kids what their third favorite reptile is without actually believing it and taking it to heart, right? So it's one of those things where if the administration is not passionate about it, and if the coworkers are not passionate about it, it's going to be really hard with that. So what I say is that when you look at that, we have to get that buy-in. We can't just walk into a school and say, you know what, we're all doing circles one time a week on Wednesdays. And that's it, because that's the expectation, right? So you have to get that buy-in. You have to get the why. You have to get those people that are having a hard time with that trained. You have to hear stories. You have to hear about how it's actually worked in other schools. Because when I was first getting introduced to something like standards-based learning, for example, I thought, no way, that's terrible. If kids don't do their work, this is what happens. And it took us years to get going in my school with standards-based learning because of all that, right? Because no one would just say, here's a school that's done this, and here's what it looks like there. So I would say you have to get staff members, you have to get them in that book study with that book, and we have to have deep discussions with this. We have to realize and look at the brain research and know that, the teenagers in my building don't have fully developed brains, and here's why, and here's how they act out, and here's why they do that, and they don't feel safe. There's no belonging. You know what I mean? Like, this is why they might be acting in a certain way. If you teach without relationships, you're not going to really get much accomplished in my humble opinion, right? So it's one of those things where you have to have a passion for it. You have to live it, and breathe it, and be restorative in everything that you do and how you talk about it with your staff. But you have to have people actually engaged in the pre-work ahead of time. You can't just say, you know what, we're going to connect before we correct this year, and we expect everyone to do it, right? So it's going to take some time, and we have to actually spend some of our time with it. We have to actually make sure that when we're doing this, we can, give teachers time to digest it and to think about it and to get deep with it, not just, hey, this is our initiative this year, and go.
All right, great response. So Trelane asks, can you talk about using restorative practices for physical altercations with students?
Absolutely. So I will tell you that when it comes to physical altercations, we don't have kids punch each other in the face and then we put them in a room together immediately. That's probably not the best thing you want to do right there, because and somebody mentioned in one of the comments, like, you have to be at a point where you're regulated before you can have a discussion about that's restorative. You can't be dysregulated and really mad and throwing chairs, and then we ask a kid, tell me how you're feeling right now. I mean, that it's not going to work. They're not in the right brain or body state right then to actually have this discussion with them. Once we have the kids in the fight calm down, and we might have to have a separation of a couple of days out of school. I hate to say it, but sometimes, when it comes to physical violence and safety, we might have to have some time out, right? We might have to have some time to cool down. But the thing is, though, is that once we come back from that, we have to let the parents know on both sides, hey, we would love to bring the two boys or the two girls or however they identify together, because this problem that happened is not solved and it's going to continue on. And we think if we can talk through it and figure out why this happened and work through it and, all those other kinds of things. So I like to get permission when I can, when it involves a bigger behavior like a fight or an altercation, right? I don't have to have permission just to talk to a kid when they're on Minecraft during class, right? So when I do that and I bring them in, we have to be very clear on the ground rules. We have to let them know that I am the one who is going to monitor this discussion. I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to ask the other person a question. And again, this is all before the two kids are even together. Like, we have to preview exactly what's going to happen in this meeting, because the last thing we want to do is put two kids that have just gotten, they're still hot, if they've been out of school for a few days, and then throw them into a room because one kid's going to say, well, the other kid said this about my mom. And the other kid's going to be like, well, you did this. And then all of a sudden they're up in each other's face again, right? Like, we have to talk about what's going to happen. We have to talk about what questions are going to be asked. We have to talk about what to do if the other person across from you says something that you don't agree with, how might you respond. So a lot of it is in the pre-work before you even have that meeting and that discussion. You have to think about, where you're placing the kids in the room. You have to think about, the kid that might, you don't want to put the kid that you think might be the aggressor. You don't want to put them on the opposite side of the room and then four adults and then another kid by that door. You want to have a kid feel like they're not trapped. You want to have it, you have to think about the room placement and all those other kinds of things. But the International Institute for Restorative Practices has good questions you can ask. If you look up IIRP 5 questions, you can find the 5 questions that you might ask to the person that caused the harm that work really well. But I will tell you, if you just ask those 5 questions haphazardly at each kid, they can fake it and go through the motions. So you have to do a really good job of prefacing what this is and why this is doing it. And we've had people cry. We've had people, really become really good friends who were friends, but now they're friends again, because we didn't realize that when the kid called the other kid chubby, that it really bothered them, more so than it would have, because their girlfriend said the same thing about him a week ago, and now their confidence is shattered. And this is why I acted this way. And yes, I shouldn't have hit you, but I just want to let you know this is why I got to the point I did. You know what I mean? It's all about the and all those other kinds of things. But I could spend all day talking about this restorative conversation with two kids that have gotten an altercation. But that's the best I can do in a few minutes.
Yes, great response. And so thinking about students with disabilities, specifically those on the spectrum that may have a harder time understanding another perspective, Kelly asks, what suggestions for restorative practices do you have that can help them?
Sure. And I work with students that, might be on the spectrum. I work with students that were nonverbal. I've worked with a lot of different students that, sometimes the communication is a little bit harder and harder to understand. So that's why I like to think of empathy as not just for the other kid, but also for you. How did it impact you when this happened? What might you do instead of this next time? And you never stop trying to build empathy, even if you never have a deficit mindset where you think a kid has autism, can't understand feelings and things like that, right? Like it might not always be the same. You might have a kid that doesn't have autism that just literally has no empathy. I've had a kid tell me they were black-hearted. And I was like, black-hearted? What does black-hearted mean? I mean, that means they have no feeling because they've gone through so much trauma. They've lost so much that they don't feel anymore. I've heard all kinds of things. When we think about students, especially students on the spectrum, is we need to try it and we need to do a similar process and not have a deficit mindset going in, but you might have to scaffold the questions more. So you might say, how do you think, who do you think you impacted with this when you threw this across the room? They might not understand that it impacted the teacher, right? So you might have to actually say, well, how do you think they felt how do you think I felt when I threw it? Well, I don't know. Well, it made me feel sad. You might have to actually, throw in how it made you feel, or, hey, maybe it did make the other kid feel, or how would you feel if somebody stole your backpack? So we might have to work a little bit harder if they're not quite getting it. And again, it's something that over time, some kids might take that very first discussion and never do it again. Some kids might have something going on cognitively. They might have, a disability of some sort. They might have a trauma. They might have other experiences where we just keep at it and keep working on it with students. So long story short is I would go about it in a very similar way and I would scaffold it. And again, the student, this is like, I treat every student like they might have trauma, like they might have ODD, like they might have something going on. That's why ahead of time, I let them know, here are the 5 questions. Here's what's going to be asked. Here's what you might do in case you don't agree with the other person. All that other kind of stuff, that front loading and having that discussion ahead of time is going to make it a lot easier when you get down to it.
All right. So the questions continue to come in. And so I'm going to kind of go through them a little quickly. When we talk about like having parents that work in the district or maybe even work in the school, do you have any suggestions for dealing with students whose parents are like right there? And that's asked by Kimberly.
Absolutely. I've had some parents that worked in my district. I've worked with schools where there was parents, like administrators in another building, and their kid got in trouble at another school, which was awkward, right? So in my humble opinion, we have to think about, district-wide initiative. Like this is a district thing. This is where we're going as a district, and here's how we're going to do it. It can't exist in silos. Like one school is doing it out of 30 schools in your building. Yeah, you can start there, but it becomes way easier when your district is doing this, right? So that a teacher at another school knows that this is how it works. This is how it goes. So when you have that, you don't give the kid, you might let the other parent know and treat them like they're another parent and say, hey, this is what we've tried and this is why we're doing it this way. But I tend to, I'm not going to not give you a consequence just because your mom is the principal of the elementary school and I'm at the middle school level. It's just a matter of, I would hope that they would have a better awareness of why we're doing restorative practices. And it's hard to argue with restorative practices because if something's broken, you fix it. If you harm it, you make it right. I mean, it's hard to argue with the logic unless they want a more severe consequence for their kid, right? But, like they would argue harder, in my opinion, if their kid got suspended for 5 days than it would be, hey, you're only going to be suspended for 2 to 3 days with this and making this right. So it's very helpful when, again, it's a district initiative and it's a school initiative versus I'm one teacher in my building doing restorative practices, and I have a kid, and the teacher who is in the other school doesn't even understand what that's all about. But that's a long-term fix. The quick fix is that you have to be very clear and transparent with your parents. This is how we do discipline. This is why we do the discipline. It's in your newsletter. It's in your communications. All that kind of stuff ahead of time.
Yes. Speaking of newsletters, I'm going to plug the LinkedIn newsletter for TeacherGoals. They can sign up through LinkedIn, correct?
Correct.
Yes. All right. Back to the question. Sarah asks, how do you feel about class dojo? She was told not to take points off right away, but to do it later.
Okay. So I can't speak, like I have a behavior, like we have a restorative practice system called Behavior Flip that we use because we found that other systems didn't do what we want them to do. So I'm not going to speak illy about any behavior management app, but I will tell you that when it comes to points and giving points and taking away points, it's a very carrot and stick approach. It's, if you do something bad, I'm going to dock you. If you do something good, I'm going to give you a point. So when we think about something like that, and we think about points and things like that, so you start to train the mind to only do things that are good because you get rewarded for it, right? It's like it's like the what is it called? Pavlov dog, right? Like they hear the bell, they start running when there's dinner, and all of a sudden when there's no bell, there's no motivation. So when I think about things like that, I don't want to threaten that you will lose points if this happens to a kid, because you should actually have that restorative conversation. You should build that environment where there's less acting out. We have to have that touch base and that logical consequence. A point and taking away a point or gaining a point is not really a restorative consequence or a logical consequence. So when you think about that, you also get into, am I actually catching kids being good as often as I'm seeing them misbehave? Oh, am I giving kids rewards for doing things they would have done otherwise? Like, yeah, you should come to class on time. I shouldn't have to give you a point because you came to class on time. I shouldn't have to give you a point because you brought a pencil to class. Like, these are just the expectations, right? So when I'm thinking about that, also, you should never have a public display of a clip chart of a app or anything like that, so the rest of the kids can see it as well. I can go on a whole tangent about this, Erica, but like long story short is that we want kids to do the right thing because it's the right thing intrinsically, not because they gain or lose something tangible, or they get a class reward, or they go to a store and get a trinket. We also have to realize is that when we're looking for the things that are good or bad, we have to consider our implicit bias. There's been studies where we might our eyes might be focused more on our African American males than they are on any other student in that class. So you know what I'm going to see misbehave more? And if I'm looking at the boys more often than the girls, I might not notice the good things the girls are doing either. So we have to also consider our own biases in these things as well.
Mm-hmm. And does your advice change at all based on the age groups? So like, the point systems or any of the strategies that you've talked about tonight, do you do anything differently for younger kids than older students? How do you feel about that?
So I'm gonna say this. Sometimes 5-year-olds are better at the restorative conversations than 18-year-olds. Sometimes the 5-year-olds are a lot more willing to discuss something, or a lot more open-minded about what happened, or not wanting to punch the other kid in the face. So like I look at that like they're kids, but we can't infantilize the older kids. So I do a very similar process. It's just that when I'm doing my circle, I am asking the older kids something, and I might have to scaffold it for the littler kids. Like, for example, I might ask an 18-year-old, what would you rather be able to fly, or would you rather be able to have superhuman strength, and why, or something like that, right? I might ask that of an 18-year-old. I might ask that of a 5-year-old. It's just that you have to consider also. You have to consider the cultural things as well. Like, I shouldn't ask, what is your favorite Christmas present? I shouldn't ask, what's the craziest place you've ever been on vacation to? Like, you have to consider culture. You have to consider who's in the building, who's in your classroom, and all those other kinds of things. But these strategies are universal. I use these strategies with adults. I use the strategies on my wife. Like my wife, I'll not have the dishes put away, and she'll be mad. Like, hey, why are you not putting away the dishes? But and I'll say, what I heard you say was, tell me more about that. It's hilarious because you can't stay mad at somebody that's keeping a cool, calm, and collected head, right? I'll use this with I have a 4-year-old. I have who just turned 5. I have a 6-year-old just turned 7. I have a 9-year-old. I use these strategies on my own kids. I use these in 4th grade. I use them at the middle school level. I use them with adults in staff meetings. It's just a matter of when we do these strategies, again, you might have to scaffold. Like an older kid might, you might get to the point quicker where they understand how it impacted other kids, right? Whereas you're dealing with somebody who's 7, you're very like me-centric. When you're 7 years old, you don't really understand the big, broader world in all cases, right? You don't understand your whole community and the impact on the whole community as much. So again, it might take more scaffolding with those as well. And I did notice some of the comments with behaviorism. Yes, like what we were talking about was behaviorism for sure. When we look into, training people to behave in a certain way versus modeling it and being it with people. So.
Yes, and I'm thinking that I need to invite Elena to come on, your wife, to see how she responds to these strategies at home. So I love that. And so we have several questions that kind of ask to combine like one strategy with another. So I'm going to put all of these together. So first of all, Makia says, what place do you think DEIB has within restorative practices, and how do you suggest we get schools to invest more in their training? So when we think about, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, how do they go together?
100%. They are one. They need to be one and the same because if you have a bunch of students or a bunch of adults who look differently than their students, and again, I'm not saying anybody's racist or anything like that, but you have to also understand the diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. You have to understand all those things and have an awareness of it and catch yourself and be dedicated to understanding those things. Because again, if I have a conversation with a student that looks differently than me, like, if I'm a white male and I have a conversation with an African-American female who's 17, I have to understand that there's already a power dynamic in place historically. She might not want to open up to me. She might view me as the bad guy. You know what I mean? Like, and rightfully so in a lot of cases, because she is going through 17 years of school where she has been 1 out of the 5 people on their cell phone, but they picked her out first. She has been suspended longer than somebody who did the same thing. Their family might have a distrust of the school and what we do and things like that. So I have to have that awareness, and I have to actually understand that when I'm having a conversation with a kid, there's a power dynamic at play. They have to know that I have their back and they belong in my class before they'll even engage with me, because they'll be, somebody might not want to have that conversation with me because they view me as, who I am. And I might not get to the nitty gritty of it. They might feel targeted. They might feel impacted. So when I think about those things, you have to consider, like, I have to treat all kids again. Like when I have conversations with students, I have to form that belonging. I have to make sure that everyone feels like they matter. I have to understand who my students are. I have to understand where they're coming from and their culture and all of those things for me to even have a restorative conversation that goes well. Because I can have restorative practices and policies in my school, and I'm suspending my African-American students 3 times more often than their, Caucasian peers, even if I have restorative practices going on in my school. So if you don't have an awareness of that, if you don't really know, where we're coming from and all these kinds of things, it's not going to matter. You can't just do restorative practices without also including culturally responsiveness.
Awesome. And then we have another question that asks about connecting restorative practices with self-care. Any thoughts or ideas on that?
Yeah, when you think about self-care, I think self-care is huge. It's very valuable, but it's also used in a negative way, like almost blaming. Like we give teachers an unreasonable workload. We give them an unreasonable job expectation. And then we say, oh, just take care of yourself. I'm going to give you, I'm going to invite you to a meeting during your prep, but you go and do some yoga afterwards. So we have to, when we look at self-care, we also have to look at community care. We have to look at system care. So when I look at that, when we do self-care, like, I'm a huge believer in doing mindfulness. I'm a huge believer in having, positive imagery. I'm a huge believer in being thankful and grateful, because the more we do self-care, not just ourselves, but we have to teach it to our kids too. Like, we have to teach our kids what to do, when you're mad. You have to teach the kids what to do when they're angry. We have to teach the kids to do what they're sad. We have to teach the kids how to take care of themselves as well. And the more we model it and we speak about it, guess what? When everyone feels like they're cared for and they care about themselves, there's going to be less disruption and less behavioral issues as well. So absolutely, use self-care, but don't weaponize it. Don't tell people, I'm going to give you everything on top of your full plate already, but make sure you do breathing. Make sure you breathe about it. You know what I mean?
Yes, I love it. Use self-care, but don't weaponize it. I love that. So 2 more questions and then we're gonna wrap it up. So any advice for new teachers or aspiring teachers, student teachers?
Absolutely. Make sure, like, schools are better now than they were when I was in school, about focusing on the whole child and focusing on social emotional learning. So when I think about these things for new teachers, you need to, and I hate to say it, but this is true, you're not their friend. You love the kid, you care about the kid, but you are not their friend. You have to hold them accountable for their actions, but you also have to give them a hug and let them know you care about them later. So what I see is that when we're younger, when we first come into the profession, we want to make sure that we don't really get into, we don't want to move that kid. We don't want to take their cell phone. We don't want to have a restorative conversation. We don't want to have to call their parent because we're afraid of damaging that relationship. But I will tell you, if you don't do it, it's going to really be bad later. So even if you're starting on day 1 with your class, you need to be absolutely sure that you have expectations that are reasonable and you hold the kids to it, that you've done your due diligence, you have read the books, you've done your reading, you've hopefully gotten some training on this issue as well. But what I notice, not just with new teachers, but it tends to affect them more because they're coming in fresh. You have to have your expectations in place and hold kids to it. But the expectations, again, won't matter if the kids don't feel like they're cared for and you haven't established that community.
Awesome. And then last but not least, this can definitely be uncomfortable work. So any advice, how would you encourage staff or leaders or teachers to feel comfortable being uncomfortable in trying to do this? Great question, Jennifer.
Absolutely. Now, I have very seldomly had a perfect restorative conversation or a perfect interaction with the kid, especially when a discipline issue came up, right? Like I've yelled at my class. Like, we all have had a moment where we lost it a little bit, you know what I mean, with our class. I have used sarcasm before. I have said something that I shouldn't before. I have done everything right up until I got too close to the kid. I that's also a big thing, is giving them the personal space, not hovering, not using your power in a certain way. So when I'm looking into that, you have to be vulnerable, but you also have to have leadership that knows the work very well and can actually, again, if you feel like the leadership respects you and you feel like you respect them, and you can have a conversation that's constructive, if you don't have to worry about asking them, hey, I'm having this issue in class, what might I try, without feeling repercussion or they're judging you, right? You have to have that relationship with that administrator as well. But when I look at a discipline situation, if I'm an administrator, I might come up to I know I have to set the policies and procedures and give the teachers the tools so the less kids come to me in my office in the first place, right? But if a kid came to me, I want to touch base with that teacher and say, hey, you wrote down here that Johnny cussed at you, and thank you, and you validate that. Wow, that must have been tough, right? You show some empathy because that sucks, getting cussed out, right? But let's talk about what was going on before then. Like, talk about the antecedent, like what was happening before that. Hey, when you got to this point, like, how close were you to him? Or we got to this point when you asked him this question, do you understand maybe that him as I'm trying to think, when you think about him as an African-American male, this is maybe how he felt about that kind of thing, right? That, like, you have to actually be able to point these things out, because it's not blaming. You have to, you're not like, well, it's your fault you got cussed out and don't do it again. We have to actually go through constructively and be like, well, maybe have we tried this, right? But it's still not okay that the kid cussed you out. And the kid will still have a consequence. It's just a matter of what can we do next time to hopefully get to the point where the kid's not cussing you out again in a more constructive way. Because the answer is not just to kick the kid out of school and never come back. That kid's coming back, no matter what, right? So we make sure that we do our due diligence to do everything we can in our power to make that relationship work. Because it's not like an employee we can fire him, right? Like you can't fire people or your students. You're going to be working with them a day later, if not 3 days later. So we have to
Right.
be open to that. But again, if your administrator is not someone that you can talk to or listen to, it's going to be a lot harder to take that constructive criticism and not feel attacked. Well, what do you mean you're asking me what I said to the kid? You know what I mean? Like you have to have that relationship, and that's how they have to come at it in a constructive way.
Awesome. So I have learned so much. People in the comments have shown that they have learned a lot tonight. They are asking questions. Any classes we can take online. For those of you that are like, I want to keep learning from Brad, you can connect with him at teachergoals.com/PD. We have several people asking questions about your book. What's the title of the book? Would love to add it to the library. The book is called Hacking School Discipline, and you can get that at teachergoals.com/school discipline. Melanie says she just purchased it. I personally have the book and definitely recommend it. She can't wait. So thank you all for your support. Thank you, Brad, for being here with us tonight and building such a phenomenal community. And thank you all, everyone that joins us every week. We love you. We appreciate you. You are valued. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you all. And thanks so much for coming tonight. And make sure to reach out if you need anything. And I hope to see you next time.
Yes. Have a good night, everyone.
All right. Thank you.